Okay, so welcome back to the Structural Racism and Health Professions Education Summit. If you're just now joining us, we're now headed into the second panel, as you can see on the screen, changing the experience of students and faculty of color in health profession schools. And as your panel moderator, we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Dr. Miranda Ward, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Clinical Research and Leadership in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at the George Washington University, where I also serve as the Ambassador Program Lead for our HRSA-funded Health Careers Opportunity Pipeline Program and an Emerging Scholars Fellow with one of the co-sponsors of today's event, the School of Medicine and Health Sciences Anti-Racism Coalition. So allow me to introduce you to our esteemed panel. So I will say that the panelists' full bios are actually available online. You saw them kind of scroll through during the brief break, but I do want to just provide a brief introduction to our panelists. So I'll start with Dr. Mark Neve. He is the Executive Vice President for Institutional Advancement at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. So before this role, though, he served as a member of the executive leadership team of the AAMC, where he provided leadership on issues surrounding community engagement, diversity, and health equity at medical schools and teaching hospitals across the US and Canada. So it's obviously very fitting for him to be on this panel. He's joined by Dr. Kenya Beard, who is Dean of Nursing and Health Sciences at Nassau Community College, which is part of the State University of New York system. And as a former Macy faculty scholar, she founded the Center for Multicultural Education and Health Disparities. And in her former role as Senior Fellow at the Center for Health Policy and Media Engagement at GW School of Nursing, she actually co-produced healthcare disparity segments for the center's radio program, Health Cedra. And then we also are joined by LaShira Lash Nolan, who is a second-year student at Harvard Medical School, where she's serving as student council president of her class, the first documented Black woman to hold this leadership position. She is a fervent advocate for social justice, whose commentary you may be familiar with because she's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, NPR, among others. You can see that on her bio. Her work has most certainly earned her the honor of becoming the 2020 National Minority Quality Forum's youngest 40 under 40 leader in minority health. Congratulations. And was actually named a 2020 Young Futurist by the Root magazine. And then Dr. Maria Soto Green is also on our panel today. She's a professor and executive vice dean at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, where she oversees all aspects of undergraduate medical education, faculty affairs, professional development, accreditation, and diversity affairs. So these programs really do support and contribute to career advancement, as you can imagine, for the next generation of social justice champions, as we were talking about on the first panel. So equity, diversity, and inclusion is most certainly threaded into everything that she does. So each of these dynamic speakers were invited to participate on this particular panel because what we want to do is we want to identify both the institutional and the structural barriers that really hinder greater diversity of the health workforce. And we want actionable steps that we can take, right? So not enough to just continue to have the conversation around the scope of the issue. What can we do to actually reduce these identified barriers? And we actually want to hear from you, right? So this is why I've actually decided to pose specific questions to each of our panelists, not only for some voice equity, but also to really tap into their specific expertise, as I just kind of highlighted in reading of their bios. So this is going to limit, I will say, their comments to 8 minutes. Just a reminder, panelists, 8 minutes total, so that we really can turn to the chat and field the questions so we can have a, a participatory interactive discussion today. But just like the first panel, we're going to have about 10 to 12 minutes for questions at the end. And the summit team is actually going to curate some of those questions from the chat so that they can be answered live by our panelists. And, any remaining questions, again, unfortunately, if we do have questions that we just didn't have time to get to, the good news is that they will most certainly still be answered, because we're going to have all of the panelists answer them offline, and we're going to post their responses on the Mullen Institute's website. So just a reminder, please be sure to live tweet during our the entire summit, but also this panel. You can use the hashtag GWMI Equity Summit. So why don't we just go ahead and get started with some level setting. As you can imagine, given the political, social, cultural moment that we're in right now, the concept of anti-racism has really become part of both the national and the international lexicon. Would we agree? There are many institutions that have issued statements of solidarity against anti-racism in all of its forms, right? While others have actually demonstrated measurable commitments through, cluster hires, for example. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with cluster hires, this is actually an emerging practice in higher education. It involves hiring faculty into multiple departments or colleges around interdisciplinary research topics. And this is just one of many aims to actually increase faculty diversity, for example. There actually was a recent Inside Higher Ed article that really critiqued diversity initiatives for failing to address historical and structural racism. And as you heard us kind of talking in the briefing during the break, Dean Bowen Matthew really gave a contextually rich keynote on the connection between racism and health. And so there are really many examples of structural racism, from so-called race neutral policy and the hidden curriculum to even algorithms that reflect and reinforce racial bias. So to ensure that everyone has a baseline understanding, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Beard. Will you start off our conversation with a couple of specific examples of what structural racism in health professions even looks like?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Ward. So you asked, what does structural racism look like in health professions education? First, let's uncouple the two words and think back to when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. shared that our race in racism was linked to a false doctrine of the congenital inferiority and worthlessness of a people. The ism is what people do based on that false doctrine. So what we believe influences our behaviors and influences our practices. Can we see remnants of that false belief of the congenital inferiority and worthlessness of a people today? Were Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others, were they viewed by their murderers as inferior and worthless because of their skin color? And did that false doctrine contribute to how people responded to them? How do we end this vicious cycle where every generation replays the same horrific scenes, albeit the names and faces change? We experience the same outrage, the same recommendations, and then nothing. So in what ways can their brutal and dehumanizing deaths help to inform health education and improve the experience of students and faculty? When the Institute of Medicine published Unequal Treatment, I was aghast by the fact that here it was in print that we as providers treat people differently based on the color of their skin, and some have poorer outcomes because of it. In the 70s, we treated females differently when they had chest pain. We owned up to it, we put practices in place, and realized that we could do better. Again, we addressed the issues and their lives improved. Fast forward to today. Structural racism is that elephant that's still in the room waiting to be acknowledged, addressed, mitigated. So what are we doing? Many want to run away from it, ignore it, or deny it. But how do you run away from something that surrounds you? The Institute for Healthcare Improvement states that as healthcare providers, we have to understand, recognize, call out, and have the ability to mitigate structural racism. So you wanted to know what it looks like and what it is. Well, structural racism is an omnipresent force that encompasses all the inequitable systems that surround us, that perpetuate discriminatory beliefs, and that normalize and legitimize practices that benefit you if you're white and produces toxic harm when you're not. Structural racism is that force. Although in healthcare, we exist in a sea of highly educated and humanistic colleagues, we have yet to conquer that force. Partly because structural racism extends through and beyond healthcare and health education. It wraps around housing, criminal justice systems, economics, and employment systems. So what does it look like in education? For me, when you send your child off to college and he comes home and says that his teacher said that African Americans are a risk factor for low IQ, and you get so annoyed and you want to call that teacher, and your son says, no, wait, don't blame the teacher. It's in my textbook. So you open up the textbook and surely it's an outdated textbook and you find out it's 2018, where in the chart it says, and it lists African Americans as a risk factor for low IQ. Where do you go from there? Besides calling the publishing company and saying, this is outrageous. This is how these false beliefs get perpetuated. So yes, we can see how the education system is perpetuating false beliefs of inferiority. And when those undergrads come to your school and become providers or educators tainted by the false doctrine that is reified in our textbooks, and that belief of inferiority and worthlessness gets normalized and legitimized by our admission practices, our hiring practices, promotion practices, and yes, tenure practices. We need to pull back and recognize the extent to which those false beliefs have shaped our practices and generated inequities across all systems. We
Thank you so
become
much.
those providers who are the lead players in Sentinel documents like unequal treatment, wondering, how did I become a producer of that toxic harm called healthcare disparities? And what are we doing to recognize, call out, and mitigate those false beliefs that are ending in our demise?
We appreciate that history, Dr. Beard. Yes, this is a great way for us to kind of think about at the core what's really important is racial equity. So let's actually turn things over to Dr. Soto Green. Given all your work with pipeline programs and centers of excellence, what is moving away from these kind of standalone diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and towards racial equity and a racial equity lens really look like?
So I think what we are experiencing as a nation is really that absolute call to action, and that for decades now, right? We've done diversity, we expanded the dialogue to be inclusion, and then we built equity. But now, by really calling it out by its name, right? And we've heard, very, very well put, that is racial equity, it really hones us in and it focuses us on what we need to be paying attention to in terms of achieving comparable outcomes, and really looking at bona fide actionable steps that runs towards and not away in terms of having the dialogue in our nation's medical schools, for example, around race, racism, privilege, right? White privilege, white identity, and that we really look to seek the solutions through working with all of our constituent stakeholders, but really translating them into policies, procedures, processes that are really designed to fill the gaps, but that we're seeing everyone. As we know, the call to action has been led largely by our students, but it's us who need to respond and really looking in the mirror and seeing ourselves. So I love the fact that now we're going to go from truly going DEI, right, as we've always referred to it, to really making that E, right, the most important pillar, because in doing so, we will achieve the true diversity and inclusion, that we desire. And so really one of the critical things, and, I know you'll ask, in the, upcoming, is what can we do as senior leaders, right? And not continue to give this to others, right? And accept the responsibility for our actions and really seeing our true selves which sometimes can be quite painful, no matter how hard we've worked, even at our school for decades. That's a pillar, in diversity inclusion. We do well, never good enough. So I will say never good enough. But in the faculty sphere, we do well. We are benchmark at 80th percentile. But what is 80th percentile of a percentile? That's pretty nominal, right? When you look across. And so those are the types of things that are moving us to a true equity and having the difficult conversations that we need to have.
Thank you for that, Dr. Soto Green. So you focus on, the E of the DEI, but let's take it a step back for a moment. So I appreciate that. Let's focus on the D, right? Let's move into those diversity aims more specifically. So despite the existence of the AAMC's holistic admissions criteria, we know there remains admission committees that believe that students of color are underqualified and that any attempts to recruit more students of color requires a lowering of standards for admission. So Lash, using this racial equity lens that, Dr. Beard and, Dr. Soto Green just mentioned, in what ways do you believe that admission standards and practices and policies basically maintain whiteness, right? How can we unlearn and reframe what counts as a good student?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for that question and for allowing me to share this space with you all. And I just want to make sure that I also make space for the challenges that the Black community have been going through as we deal with the injustice that we continue to see due to police brutality, thinking of the family of Walter Wallace at this moment. And in regards to this question in particular, I can kind of just walk y'all through my experience of being a URM student applying to medical school. And, first of all, I'll say that I didn't meet a Black doctor until my freshman year of college. So while all of my other colleagues and friends, I went to Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. It's a private Jesuit school. And while all of my friends were able to, who were interested in medicine, they were able to shadow uncles, their parents, all of these different folks who were already in medicine. So because of the way that we think about extracurriculars and shadowing and things like that in the medical school application process, that's already setting people, we're already creating inequity because not everyone has access to the same shadowing opportunities. And then the other issue was thinking about how different institutions are recruiting students to apply to medical school. So I know, I go to Harvard Medical School, but I wonder, how much recruitment are we doing at HBCUs? Like, are we setting up shop, when folks are on their way to lunch or whatever the case is, to say like, hey, like this, we want you at our institution. And I think that's across the board for all medical schools, really thinking about where that recruitment is happening. And I think the other piece we have to really consider is when we're thinking about extracurriculars is who is able to afford international immersion trips to do medicine, who is able to afford doing extracurricular activities is a privilege because some of us come to these spaces and we have to work. We have to support our families. We have to do work study to afford our educations. And I think that when it comes to thinking about how those things are valued on the admission during the admissions process, we need to make sure that we look at those student experiences and try to understand how those experiences have also helped them become an even better fit for medicine. And it's not just about, how many shadowing hours have you done or how high were your test scores, because we also know the standardized tests aren't a measure of intelligence necessarily, but more so of your socioeconomic status. And I think that all of these things continue to be great pillars of the admissions process, but we really need to stop thinking about it as lowering standards, but really just expanding them to understand that not everyone is coming from the same place. And we have to continue to look at distance traveled, because doing anything but is going to continue to maintain white supremacy and who we see as our ideal physician. And oftentimes that's not what our communities need.
Absolutely. And I, as a proud graduate of the illustrious Spelman College, I appreciate you naming the importance of pulling in, historically Black colleges and universities into this discussion, and also appreciate you, identifying the social and cultural capital of white families and how that has been, considered the standard for these admissions criteria. So Dr. Neve, given your experiences, what other assumptions, kind of building off what Lash just offered, what other assumptions do you believe that we are making at institutions, right, related to what diversity resources are really needed? And what does the literature and our students actually tell us that they actually need?
Actually, it's unfortunate that I have to follow Lash because she just hit the nail on the head there. So I really don't have much to add except to say we need to hear, we need to get that perspective, in front of audiences, not just like this, but much more broader audiences. So I just appreciate everything she had to say. In fact, I was going to highlight this idea of, our underrepresented minorities are often, taking their, doing pre-med as their coursework. And if you really look at, the vast majority of medical students now, white medical students are not pre-med. They take the pre-med requirements. They travel globally, and they come back with, I've been to Bolivia or wherever else on my, CV, my resume, and they apply to medical school and they stand out because they took the classes. They took them separately, not the way you typically get guidance from your, advisors, taking all these hard classes back to back. They've enjoyed college. And again, to Lash's point, I think she hit it much more articulately than I can. It's fundamental socioeconomic layered on with race conundrum that we face. And the system is not designed to appreciate that. Although it will tell you that it has this broader lens, looking into individuals' backgrounds, attributes, personality. In the end, it is still truly a mirror of who's in leadership, who are on the admissions committee. They're looking for their future selves. And oftentimes it's not enough of us, either on the admissions committee or in leadership, to see our future selves and our Black children or brown children. And so that's just a blunting mechanism that, is just part of, a fundamental flaw, I think, in our limited thinking, and not just the admissions process, but really in academic medicine more broadly. The thing I do want to just touch on and, let you move to another panelist is I just see a question in here specific to me, so I figured I'll just jump on it, which is the lack of Black males. I guess what I'm known for is a report I wrote back in 2014 now on the lack of Black men in medicine. I was preparing for a talk at Howard, and the talk was about diversity broadly, but I just really wanted to hone in. It was Howard, and I really wanted to hone in on African Americans. And I have to tell you, for somebody who's been doing this work for 25 years, in 2014, I was startled to see that there were less African-American men in the first year in medical school class, in 2014 than there were in 1978. And I had to cut that data 3 times before I was comfortable stating that out on the stage at Howard. And it turned out to be true. And we wrote a report on it. Great colleagues there at AAMC did a lot of good work, to publish that report. And so the question is, so we know that what's happening now. Well, there's great work as a great colleague I have here at this institution, Dale Okorodudu, who's doing a Black Men in Medicine initiative. It's fantastic, but that's one individual with a bunch of other, physicians. And this is not meant to sound like the criticism it will sound like, but once again, it is those of us who are harmed that are solving or attempting to solve the problem. So, and that's fantastic. And Dale and all of the cousins, many of us that are, doing this hard work. But the questioner is asking about the institution. What are the institutions doing? And I will simply sum it up by saying not enough.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for taking that question now. I'm glad we had time. And so I think we're ready to go ahead and expand the conversation and talk more about inclusion and equity. So we know that, just kind of, it's, diversity is just not enough, right? Oh, let me get in and have, kind of Black and brown bodies and have like this representation in this count. We know that's not enough. And that's why the White Coats for Black Lives, they actually advocate that medical schools really take proactive measures to not just recruit, but spend energy, effort, and have the infrastructure to retain students of color. And while doing that, prioritizing undocumented students, students from the local community, and even compensating students of color for their time who participate in those recruitment efforts, because we definitely don't see enough of that. We also see that there's institutions committed to being anti-racist. They've acknowledged the need to really strategically realign, the mission and the vision and the values to really have some kind of reconciliation on racism and racial inclusivity and health justice. So yes, we can look to the White Coats for Black Lives because they've offered us 14 measurable outcome metrics for this very purpose. But Dr. Soto Green, what are some other ways that we can really kind of hold our institutions accountable to providing us with accessible and high quality health professions training that promotes racial equity?
So I think the White Coats for Black Lives, called and really provoked us to be thinking about it. But as you can see, it's not until now that people are beginning to pay attention, right, to the racial justice and monitoring that we need. So part of it is that we could, again, continue to respond to external influences, but until institutions themselves, right? So I think it's a combination of both. We have to be both institutionally driven as well as collaboratively driven. What does that actually do and play out? And one of the things that reminds me with Dr. Kendi was, we have to be constantly self-critical. Right? Are we ever there? No. And we have to also do regular self-evaluation. And those are the premises of what we call, those institutional self-studies. So I am a big advocate that, in my role being fortunate to, and it's sad that I would even say fortunate, right? But I was fortunate that I moved from one to the next and someone noticed something in me that then opened the door. And then it allowed me to exercise my full potential. And one of the challenges that one can appreciate is that that's not the way that it really should be happening for individuals. It really should be that everyone is looked at through the same lens. So as institutional leaders, I'm always having the dialogue through every facet. And that's why I say we have not maximally taken advantage, right, of our administrative leadership capital. Why can't I? And what I routinely do, because yes, I do oversee the medical education. Up until recently, was GME as well. Now it's in the chancellor's office, but I'm also seated at the table, CME. All of those pieces are powerful and important for us to have change agents throughout. You can't do one without the other. So I was, and it was great to hear the colleague from Ohio State. So we made bias also one of our focused areas, and we have a 4-year health equity social justice curriculum. And doing it, right? And when you do it as a medical education, and that's the power of medical education leaders, right? That's the bread and butter, that's the accreditation linchpin, right? So think about it. If I'm diverse and I am thinking more inclusive and more around an equity line, I'm going to try to champion, right? And bring my other colleagues and my other social capital to the same seats at the table, and we will learn and move the dial together. And that's what, for me, it has been the power of myself coming, from very humble beginnings, and we never leave them, right? Poverty is poverty. Lack of education is also lack of education. Our families are benefited by our roles, but they don't fully travel fully with us, sadly enough. So I say that we have a lot more power in what we can do at institutions. So my approach has been, in everything I do, I partner with the CFO, right? Dollars matter. Our COO, right? So the marketing, the images, right? Our chairs, right? So we were fortunate just in the last 5 months, we recruited, and Mark, you would like this, we had 3 new African-American male faculty. Did that happen by chance? No, it's a partnership, right? And what is it that we need, particularly here in the city of Newark and the community that we have? And what is it that our students need as role models? And it's faculty who change engines. So I say that I think we need to do that. I've been the other thing in this health equity, we found a gap, right? With everything that happened nationally, we needed to do more. We have racism in it, but we moved to now a structural racism competency that will
Okay.
roll out. It's approved by our curriculum committees for next May across all 4 years. Everything from education, small groups, we're mapping it out, to including our 4th years in a capstone, right? To write and
Okay.
talk about and seek solutions. So these
well,
are
thank you.
the things that, and then I know we need to move on, but I just want to say that what has happened historically to all of us, I'm one of the few, you know, you can say Latina, Latinx, the dean, one of the few African-American deans, right? Right, particularly in a majority medical school. And why is that? Because we are usually channeled from the time we graduate medical school, we do residency. Where are we, right? We are tapped for our acumen, our skill set in the front lines, but front lines should be dispersed throughout. Why can't I open the door and the pathway to be a division chief, a chair, senior associate dean for faculty affairs and education? And that's where that structural, right, racism and inequity is playing itself out. But you
Right.
will hear more, lots
Okay.
coming. So you will be very
Thank
happy.
you.
And I, you know, that we are taking on that challenge nationally, and there's a framework coming out for the nation.
All right, thank you for sharing your biography, Dr. Soto Green. We'll roll that into hopefully our conversation when we have a talk more fully with the attendees. So one, thank you for making it very clear that you want to see an institution's values, look at their budget, right? So, and we most certainly want to talk a little bit more about that social justice curriculum that you just outlined. So we'll, you know, hopefully that comes up in our discussion. But let's go ahead and let's go back to what you were saying, you know, Lash, about some of your experiences. So how do you think that conversations, like how do we have these conversations, right, within our institutions, especially when racial inequity has really been routinized, right? It's kind of like, it's just the, you know, regularly scheduled program. So it makes it seem that, you know, when there is any attempt to change, that change seems oppressive. It seems time consuming. It seems costly. So what are your thoughts on how we can start to have these conversations?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. And I think the first thing is these should not be lunch talk discussions. They should not be optional discussions. They need to be mandatory parts of our curriculum. Because the way that it goes is that it's the same people going to the same lunch talks, eating the same pizza, talking about the same issues every time. And that can't be the case. We need to bring people into the fold who aren't used to these conversations, who are uncomfortable and really need to be in the room. And I think that starts with really looking at our curriculum and making sure that these conversations are integrated. The second thing is, if we're going to have these conversations, they need to be, it needs to be professionals who are leading the conversations. It shouldn't be a 30-minute, 1-hour orientation that cardiologists go through to then teach students about these things. Because just like you wouldn't have a person who is a pulmonologist teach me about the heart, you shouldn't have someone teach me about racial injustice and inequity who doesn't have any background in it or has no formal training. And I think that that's been the case that I've seen often when we do have these conversations. And then the other piece is, you know, what my family always says, if you're going to talk about it, you need to be about it. And I think that a lot of people are saying like, yeah, you know, we're anti-racist, et cetera, but still there are residents and students who can't afford to live in their cities. There are still essential workers who work at these hospitals who aren't able to get paid sick leave. There are still folks who are being displaced by the expansion of hospitals. So there are a lot of things that people are saying, but their actions aren't lining up with the things that they are saying. So I think that if we really seek an anti-racist future, we need to make sure that we are following through with the things that we say, and it can't be an optional discussion.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you talking about, you know, not just saying it, but being about it. And I recognize that I think one of you, maybe it was Dr. Beard, talked about being kind of self-reflective in that process. But we recognize there are a lot of, you know, again, not to rationalize it, but most certainly there are a lot of ongoing challenges. And, you know, we think about the fact that, first of all, just kind of the idea of dismantling structural racism is just potentially overwhelming, you know, kind of idea. You know, where do we even begin, right? We don't even, this is like uncharted terrain, you know, being anti-racist, because we don't we've never had an anti-racist society, right? What does that even look like, right? We're what's the blueprint? So, you know, and not to mention, while we're kind of figuring that out, we have constant threats. You know, that's really, for instance, right now, this federal ban that's, you know, proposing to suspend an institution's federal funding if we actually explore concepts like bias and white privilege, the very concepts that we've been talking about in this conversation alone, any tenets of critical race theory. And so I know that the AAMC recently issued a statement on this federal ban, but you, Dr. Neve, can you offer any advice, you know, on how we can remain, you know, focused and undaunted by these, you know, threats in our midst, as we really try to maintain our commitments and, like Lash said, you know, be about it, right? When it comes to really teaching and training about equity and justice.
You know, I'd say a couple of things. Number one, how you deal with that particular federal, you know, coming out of the current administration, you know, that quote unquote ban is to ignore it. If you work at an institution that is not ignoring it, you probably should work at a different institution, because that institution is using it as a leverage because they must not really want to do the work they're doing. And, you know, can only speak for my own institution, you know, the lawyers, and I love Dana. Dana was here, gave a great talk at my campus. But lawyers who work in any one of these settings are really mitigating risk. The decision makers make the decisions of what's important and the direction. You can take guidance from the lawyers. But if you work at an institution that says, the lawyer said, based on this ban, we can no longer do diversity training, your institution is, and your president or whoever decides to go along with that advice, I would submit is not an institution that's committed to diversity. Personally, the way I think about all of that is I just call that noise, but well, there's two things I want to say about that. One is, those of us, and probably the vast majority, maybe I'm generalizing here, of people on this phone, should recognize that that kind of backlash means there's a recognition of a change on the horizon. So you have to pull those levers and pull those things out of your back pocket, because you recognize the browning of America, the graying of America, and what that portends for the current society. And people are imagining risk for themselves. And you know, I work for a state institution, so I won't get political, but you can you know, intuit from my comments that there is a subset of the population that are right now in whiplash mode on the heels of a first African-American president. And again, kind of what they're witnessing and seeing. And so you have to come up with all of these, you know, kinds of, again, you know, tools and bans and whatever else. But I don't look at that as negative. I look at that as a sign of progress, as crazy as I know that sounds to many people. But if you're not pushing, you're not going to get somebody trying to create those bans and do all this foolishness that's occurring right now. And that means because people are pushing. So that's the one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, though, is, man, not just that, but also, I don't know how many of you are paying attention to, the way I would describe this is wicked genius. So Princeton University has been saying for over 10 years, whatever amount of time the president has been there, they've been submitting their affirmative action plans, like we all have to do as institutions, saying that we don't discriminate. Last year, or earlier this year, the president stands up and says, admits that there's structural racism here at Princeton, and he says all the things that people on this call would love to have a president say. And what happens? The federal government investigates them, right? This is the wicked genius, because they've been submitting these affirmative action reports saying that they don't have any, bias or whatever, there's whatever the affirmative action reports are displaying. So I would just say, when you want to do the things that you're talking about, which is really attack structural racism, this is not just a bunch of talk. And, Lash mentioned people say they're anti-racist. I don't know if people recognize that requires action. It's not a label that you wear. It's not a t-shirt that you wear. And so, for me, I think the way I think about all of that is you have to, if you're going to go down this path as an institution, you really need to do it, stacking hands as an institution that you're committed to this. It's not enough to, which all these schools are doing now, institutions, not just schools. another, a new version of a chief diversity officer with an executive title now or something. None of that is going to make a difference. I just want to be clear. It's about philosophies. And I'll end it there by saying it's really about institutional philosophy. And right now, the philosophy of all, especially medical schools, but of higher education in general, is not, the philosophy is about weeding talent, not creating talent. And people can argue that, but I can just tell you, no institution was created, was developed to be diverse. So you actually have to fight against the DNA. Harvard started with 6 white boys from Groton, Connecticut. It wasn't started, it was started to be elite and to keep people out. So it's fighting against its DNA to have people like Lash, be attending the institution. So we're fighting, uphill battles, basically. You're on mute.
We appreciate you, Dr. Neve, for sharing that history. So there was actually a recent editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine entitled Diagnosing and Treating Systemic Racism. And in it, the authors, really agree with Reverend Al Sharpton that we must turn this very moment into a movement. So, speaking of all this history that we've been talking about up until this point, we'll end with you, Dr. Beard. Let's really kind of, continue that, history of and thinking about historicizing our current Black Lives Matter efforts. What have we actually learned from desegregation? And since we don't talk enough about the emotional labor that's involved in this work, how do we sustain ourselves for this lifelong work?
Wow, that's a great question. We've learned so much from desegregation. For one, that you will always have individuals who are against any attempt to unite our country. Individuals who want to hold on to that false doctrine of inferiority and worthlessness based on the degree of your melanin, but we have to stay encouraged by the many people who seek to align their beliefs and actions with professional values. We've learned that policies without accountability, that's a recipe for disaster. For example, I, like countless others, experienced desegregation in the late 60s and early 70s. And many of us sat in classrooms where teachers did not want to teach us, where our existence was literally ignored. Many failed out and even more dropped out. We learned that we need mechanisms to ensure a high quality and equitable learning experience for all, and that we need to hold people accountable. And lastly, we've learned that without humanism, the valuing of humans, the ideals of policies like desegregation and diversity, they can never be actualized. So how do we sustain ourselves for this lifelong work? I think everyone has shared already on the call that it's a lot. It's hard work. It requires so much of us 24/7. It's almost akin to us being on the bottom of a mountain and trying to get to the top, and where the people who are against these policies have that unfair advantage and they're trying to stall these efforts. And yet, in spite of all of that, we continue. So what do? Stay connected. Stay connected to those who seek to unite our country. Secondly, pray for those who have come to divide and destroy. And lastly, take time to appreciate your efforts because they are making a difference.
Yeah, we got to celebrate the small wins along the way. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Beard. So we actually have some questions in the chat. So this first question is actually for Dr. Neve. It's going to help allow us to continue the conversation that you started, and I had to unfortunately cut you off. So how can medical schools begin to see communities of color through an anti-deficit lens? There are so many communities of color that offer various forms of capital that are vital to success in health profession schools. When will they begin to shift their view?
I mean, it's a complex question, but first of all, medical schools are simply there to educate the next generation. I don't think they leverage, the communities in which they are enough. outside of, the historic challenges we have around research, which I won't take the time to get into here. They recognize the asset in very limited ways. It's the students themselves that often are, learning on the community, unfortunately. And that's simply the way oftentimes the structure is. It's not lost on me that most of our, preeminent academic medical centers are quote unquote in the hood. There's a reason, for all of that as well, both, some formative reasons, but also some, not quite accidental, historical rationales for that as well. But I really don't have an answer to the question. It might just be the way it's formulated. A medical school is not an individual. Medical school is just made up of multiple individuals. It's made up of a board. So it matters who's on the board if they have the right lens of looking at a particular community. Is there an accountability mechanism for leadership to look at the community through a different lens, right? Through all the assets, an asset-based lens. And unfortunately, I think, what's happened now is most leaders can give the right talk, and most of us are comforted by that talk, and we don't look for the action, because most of us, even those of us who, again, have pay attention to the literature looking for change, we don't have a dashboard that we're looking for to hold any of these institutions accountable. In fact, that was really the work of Fitzhugh Mullen. When you really think back to what he was trying to accomplish, I know that work, continues, but that work wasn't embraced, unfortunately, the way I think it was misunderstood, quite frankly. But that kind of dashboard about where your students go, the contribution the institution makes to the community, but also leveraging the asset that the community is just, unfortunately, remains, I would say, an intellectual exercise and not real.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. So there's a question here for Dr. Beard. What do we do when we, at times, perpetuate the same thoughts towards our own?
Say that again.
When we, the ones who are engaged in this work of DEI efforts, what do we do when we just basically, I think this question is about, reflecting on the biases that we have, right? No one is kind of bias free. So what happens when we actually perpetuate those same thoughts in our work and, unintentionally?
So no one should feel like they are beyond reproach. It doesn't matter who you are. To your point, we all have biases, and it's important that we have the emotional maturity to call people out on those biases that are harmful, and do it in a way that we're not seeking to shame or blame anyone, because again, all of us have that ability to have a bias that's going to lead us in the wrong direction. But if you can humble yourself to hear from somebody who might look like you, who is telling you that you're saying something or doing something that is offensive, it requires humility. It requires emotional intelligence to take that information in and respond to it in a way that does not try to dodge the fact that we're all part of the problem in some way, shape, or form. And we can do better.
Yeah, we all have to do the unlearning, right? So it's not just them, it's like, it's all of us. Absolutely. Thank you for that, clarifying that, Dr. Beard. So then Lash, could you kind of share about, what is kind of addressing issues of intersectionality look like as we have these conversations around structural racism, really kind of extending that to thinking about, how your other identities like an LGBTQI identified person, disability, language, religion, how that can also be addressed in DEI efforts?
Yeah, 100%. I think like one of my favorite scholars is Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. And I think it's something that we continuously have to think about, because if we think about a lot of these different civil rights movements and movements that we've seen in the past, they've kind of been like co-opted to only really support and uplift certain communities. So I think that we need to continue to make sure that we're uplifting folks who have intersectional marginalized identities and making sure that they're also in the forefront of these different conversations, because Black people, for example, are not a monolith. And I think it's important that we continue to think about how these different identities come together to really create an experience that is different and challenging in various ways. So I think the best way to do it is to make sure that we're always thinking about who is in the room and who is not, and making sure that those who are not are invited to take up leadership spaces, and to make sure that we're including those individuals in these conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you for noting that. And also, we also have to think about the ways that we also engage and conduct research. Are we conducting research in a way that are we collecting intersectional data points, right? And so, you know, it's kind of like the way we even count and track and measure is kind of like not lending to the type of work that we need to do. So I appreciate that question, and then your, you know, your kind of elaboration on that, Lash. So then we also have a question for Dr. Soto Green. So you can continue what you were kind of sharing earlier about strategies that you found helpful in engaging with administrators, faculty, staff, and learners across different generations, and especially individuals from different political backgrounds, excuse me. So how do you deal with institutional resistance as part of transformational praxis?
I think it does take courage and resilience. And I think if I might expand, you need to have that language of communication, right? And you really do need to keep yourself in check. And how do I have this conversation to make the points clear, but do it in a non-judgmental way, right? When we do that, and when we start with that foundational principle, I have found that I've been able to have very difficult conversations with people and have them get to a point of mutual understanding so that we can move the dial. It doesn't happen, and you have to be very patient. It doesn't happen immediately all the time. Sometimes it's low-lying. Wow, we hit a home run. The other times it just keeps revisiting and persistence and using your other, right, stakeholders, right? Those that might be in that circle to really help tell the same story, which can be frustrating, but it's that voice amplification through allyship.
Okay, thank you for that. And then this last question is for anyone. It's kind of a big question, and we have 4 minutes until it's time for a break. So let's see who wants to take it. So institutional philosophies are often not aligned with social needs. How can the large academic health complex or health centers be accountable to the communities they serve, taking into account institutional fiscal responsibility?
So I'll go first, so we don't have that awkward silence. We have to admit, as institutions, like Dr. Neve said, we have a social contract with the communities that we serve. We can't run from that. And again, it's a matter of being accountable. Our communities have to hold us accountable. Our students have to hold us accountable. We can no longer just operate thinking that we can take people's money and not give them anything in return.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dr. Soto Green.
Oh yeah, what I've done, you know, and when we're talking about resident diversity, because remember, you've now made it, you graduated the school, but the other big stumbling block is getting into your specialty of choice. It's really having the chairs think very seriously is who's the population that we're serving, and would it benefit, right? If it experience either racial, ethnic, sexual concordance, and how might that really impact care, which is really what they're looking, especially now, you know, and they're looking at, you know, high performance organizations or pay for quality. And that conversation has worked for some in particular, and say, oh, I never thought about it that way. So it's not always about the social justice piece, sadly enough, but it's also about the business side of it, what actually makes sense. But eventually that leads to transformation.
All right, and I think this is a good place to end. So I appreciate you, all of the panelists, and Dr. Beer, you taking that question and really kind of connecting it back to the social contract that we have really reminds us of how Dr. Fitzhugh-Mullen, and the work that he led around really living our social mission, right, as health profession institutions. So I want to just again thank all of our panelists for an incredibly rich discussion. I know the Mullen Institute team, is going to include some resources on their website for all of you attendees so that you can continue to kind of be engaged in this work beyond this summit. And if you are in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at GW, I will, invite you to consider joining us on the Anti-Racism Coalition. You actually can email antiracistgw@gwu.edu. And so again, thank you for engaging with us today. And we're now going to take a 10-minute break until it's time for our final panel discussion.